So this is Mai Chao and Lee is my participant in the experiences impacting Hmong American women's identity in higher education research. So this is a practice interview for your Viandin's 8:30 research class. So Lee and I are going to be just talking about some of the questions quick, and then we'll dive right into it. All right.
Okay. So, like I was saying, the first question is a pretty hard question.
Okay.
Because I think depending on who you ask, they may or may not have thought about some of their identities. I think that there are a lot of identities that are important to me, but three that shows off pretty often and is in a sense more fluid, like I can bring with them no matter where I go, is of course I'm an artist, so that shapes a lot of my worldview. I'm also a Hmong woman, which also means I'm also a woman of color. Sometimes I use them interchangeably. And I'm also a social justice educator, so a lot of time my lens come from being an educator's point of view too. And these identities are important to me because I think in a lot of ways they shape the relationship that I want to have with people in the way that I go about meeting people or having relationships with people. And we can talk about that a little bit as we progress into other questions.
Yeah. The second question that we have here is, how do you think your identity has developed over time?
So I think my identities have always been there, and this is me thinking in retrospect, right? Like remembering back, like when did you first realize that you're an artist? Like from a young age, or like when did you realize you're a Hmong woman? Like since I was born, since I can remember. And maybe the newer one is like calling myself an educator, right? Because I think it takes a lot of courage to be like, hey, I'm an educator. And educator falls into like I'm a teacher, I'm a mentor, I'm a coach, and that's probably one of my newest identity that I've identified with. But I think it's always been there. I just haven't really named it. And so I think it's life experiences that have allowed me to fully have the language to express these views, but they've always been there. So like for being an artist, I also think that even though this is my oldest identity, it's also one that I am having a lot of trouble with. And I have a lot of trouble with this identity because so much of my foundation as an artist is based upon Western knowledge and Western art. And even though, I come from a really rich history of like Hmong art, I haven't really been able to explore that a lot. And so that's an idea or an identity that I am still developing. My identity as a Hmong woman is always fascinating. I think it's a collection of my mom, my sisters, all the amazing Hmong women and girls that I've met. I think it wasn't until I started having like Hmong students where I really started identifying with this identity because, or until like I started having my sisters and I are really close in age, and it was not until I got older where I'm like, whether I like it or not, like people are gonna look at me and they're gonna see a Hmong woman. So like let's take time to like make sense of this identity, because if I don't make sense of it and I don't portray something that is genuine to me, then it's gonna confuse other Hmong women, other Hmong girls in my life, especially my students. My women of color identity is something that I adopted to stand and work in solidarity with other women of color and indigenous women throughout the world. It comes with the understanding of how like my liberties and liberations and our liberations transcend national and international boundaries. And also as a way to keep myself grounded that, you know, even though you are like a person with this unique historical identity, you're not alone in your experiences. We, our history, our collective effort stands upon the effort of women everywhere, and so it's an identity that I keep to keep myself grounded, in a sense.
Sure.
And then, in terms of social justice educator, I think this identity is fairly new because it was in grad school that I decided that, look, you're going to make a promise that from now on, you know, your fundamental concepts and philosophy of teaching and learning is going to be grounded upon like decolonial practices that refuse to center whiteness. And you know, and this is something that I still am learning to do, but I also think that it's important for me to consider, unearth the teachings of my ancestors and their lived experiences, and you know, and this is also connecting to my identity as an artist as well. So I'm still trying to figure that part out, but those are the identities that I go forward in the world with.
And these three help kind of shape and you
Yeah,
develop into who you are today.
Yeah, I agree, yes.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. So the third question I have for you is, what ethnic community do you identify most with? And you kind of alluded to that. And how do you view that community?
You know, I think being Hmong is what I identify with. I don't know if I necessarily identify with being Asian, because I think a lot of times when I think of Asian, and this is my own bias, I think of like American definition or Western definition of Asian, and sometimes I don't fall into that mode, so I oftentimes can't identify with that. But to a certain extent, I think whether I like it or not, I am a part of the Asian community as well.
Sure.
I think the Hmong community, in terms of how do you view the community, I think that the community is in transition. You know, I think I experience a lot of pain and anger from the community, and it's something that I'm still trying to grapple with. Like, how do you explain this isolation that you feel from this community? And but at the same time, like how do you stay hopeful in the work that you do? Sometimes I think my relationship with the Hmong community is kind of like a toxic relationship. It's like a relationship where you keep coming back to because you want to be a part of it, but yet you don't necessarily know how you can be a part of it, because, you know, one, I'm a woman without a husband, and I'm an educated woman. My mom is a single mom, a widower who doesn't have a father, so I'm fatherless. And I am also still considered young enough where like people can talk down to me. And so I think these identities are very challenging because even though I see myself as something else, when in relationship to the Hmong community, I'm seen as something else. And those things I can't control because they're based upon thousands of years of cultural and social traditions, and I think I'm hopeful that we can have conversation and begin to shift the way that we look at these identities. But for the most part, I think the Hmong community, even though I love it and I love being a part of it, and there are people who are supportive of me, it's also often a space of like isolation and pain. Let's see, and I'll stop that there.
Well, I'm curious when you say the culture or the community is in transition. Like, what do you mean by that?
In transition?
Yeah.
I think that we are adopting. So the Hmong community have been doing this for thousands of years. We're adopting certain rules instead of societal norms, depending on the spaces that we live. And I say in transition, and I say this because I think deep down I'm hopeful, right? I'm hopeful that we start looking at women more seriously, I'm hopeful that we start talking about mental health. I think that in a lot of ways, whether if it's for good or bad, some of our cultural knowledge is not being transferred. And I don't know whether if that's a good or a bad thing. I think for some part it's a good thing because we have certain skills and knowledge that no longer serves a purpose in this day and age. And I think that the older generation is starting to realize that, like some of these don't serve a purpose. So how do we reimagine these tools and these knowledges so that our young folks can go forward in the world with this? So and I also think transition is a scary thing because I have a fear that one day I'm gonna walk into a store, I'm gonna meet someone, and I won't be able to tell that you and I are related, that our ancestors are related, that we can communicate in Hmong. I think that's one of the things I'm terrified of. But so I think transition is the word that I will use. I don't necessarily know if that is the best word to use in terms of what I think the Hmong community is in. I think it's in a phase of like uncertainty for sure, and I think in the next couple of years we will be able to tell if this uncertainty is necessarily a bad or a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I want you to back up a little and think of, like you said, some Hmong cultural knowledge that are not transferring or having its original purpose.
Yeah.
What are some examples in your opinion?
Yeah, I think like the idea of like women being property and women being something that can be exchanged. And maybe I'm a little old school, but my mom, I'm still considered, my kids will still be considered first gen. So seeing daughters as if they're second-rate citizens in your family, they're there as a guest until they get married. I think, and this is like evident in my life. My grandma lived with my mom until she passed away. When can we start thinking about our daughters and our mothers as people who are like head of the household and can take care of you when you die? When are we gonna stop putting all the pressure on our young males and boys to carry on the traditions of our elders and ancestors when we know that that history has taught us that women have also done this? And I also think that one of the things that I hope that we can continue in the future is to give credit where credit is. And I think we give a lot of credit to the males in our culture, but we don't necessarily give credit to the women of our culture. And I hope that those traditions, it's weird to call it tradition, but it kind of is because it's taught that way. I hope that tradition will start to shift, that we start we start validating women as people who carry knowledge and people who transmit knowledge, because they've been doing it for the last thousands of years. We just don't really validate it in that way. But other things going into the 21st century, when you start looking at gender, you start looking at sexuality. And it's funny because I had a conversation with Dr. Dia Cha.
Yeah.
And I came from a very biased view because my brother, he isn't out as gay, but he has come out to us as gay. And it was a couple of weeks ago. My mom, it was a weird, candid conversation, right? It came from like left field, and she was like, back. The elders always say. So I'm gonna say this in Hmong because I feel like it's not like equivalent in English.
Yeah.
My mom was like, and to let them live the way they are, right? And so and this came from left field because my mom And my brothers, they've always thought that my brother was like sick, that him having this identity as a gay man was a symptom of either like mental, spiritual, or even physical sickness. And so like that came from left field because I'm just like,
Wow.
well, this is what I've been telling you. Like, have I not been telling you this? And so she was like, yeah, because when he was younger, he used to like love all these things that were like very feminine, and she was like, all the signs were there. You know, I would be lying if I said that when he was young, he wasn't different. And so I think that um, and the things that I don't even think this is a revolutionary idea. You know, the concept of like gender fluidity, or the concept of having multiple different types of gender and sexuality in our culture. I don't think it's a new idea. I think it's just something that as we have been introduced into a more Western, or even a more like even a society that just labels things, right? It doesn't even have to be Western.
Yeah.
That we forget that, you know, our ancestors have encountered this years ago. We just don't, we just haven't transmitted that knowledge. Like, I wonder why that knowledge wasn't transmitted. But that's what I mean by like things I hope that we can either let go or trying to embrace it in a different way. Because whether we like to believe it or not, like our young folks, they're like fearless in the way that they're living their lives, and it would be like unfortunate if we're not allowing them to be fearless in their own identities, because then we're hypocrites, and then we don't champion them. So I think that it's a challenge that I hope everyone would take on.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that one. On all of them. Your
Yeah,
in-depth
that's a long
answer was
explanation.
fantastic. Thank you. So the fourth one is, what does your environment or environments teach you about yourself?
Yeah, so I think I have to think about like what is my environment, right? So I exist in the higher ed world, and I exist as a Hmong woman in the Hmong community, and I exist as a woman of color in the wider white community, and I think, to be truthful, like whether if I'm in either three of those, I feel quite invisible, and I feel invisible. But I also think that's weird because I'm a very outspoken person, so I don't know if like I'm purposely invisible. But you know, it doesn't matter how much I talk. Sometimes I still feel like I don't have a voice. In the Hmong community, I feel like I'm never gonna be able to take on the role as an elder. Like I don't know when that's actually gonna happen, because I don't think that we have really started to conceptualize what it means to be an elder in this current day and age. Because then I have to be married, and then my worth is like going to be tied to my husband, and so like there are so many of us who aren't married, who have who are in relationships, but they so I'm confused about my environment and what it teaches me. I think sometimes it teaches me that I can't be too smart. And you know, whether if this is my own bias I'm putting myself, or what I'm learning for the community, I can't be too smart because people won't either, one, take me seriously, or two, they'll just try to dismiss me because a woman who's intelligent sounds like ludicrous, right?
Yeah.
And so, or at least that's what my environment has taught me.
Yeah,
and you know, it's funny because if this is all what my environment is teaching me, like, why am I different? And so I'm confused that part too, because I think that I have turned out relatively okay, despite the environments that I'm in. And I think that is like thanks to the grounding that I have from other women of color, right? And because, you know, I think that even though my environment with other women of color is not as visible, I think there's still an environment there. And in that environment, you know, I feel very empowered. I feel I feel like I'm a part of a bigger group, and I feel valued. Um, let's see. Yeah, I mean, we can go on forever
Yeah,
in
we
terms
can.
of that question, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Tell me a story about an experience where you felt oppressed or discriminated against.
This is probably the hardest question, and I think it's hard for multiple reasons.
Okay.
I think it's hard because I can't even pinpoint like a specific story because I think there's so many. And I think like some of these stories have different weight to like how it has shaped or shifted my point of view. And I think that some of them I haven't even come into terms with, right? Because part of the survival likeness of me is that sometimes you can't unpack some of these experiences because it's a little too much to handle. But if I were to think of one like right now, I think about, so this was right during during the time of Trump's like candidate election time. I lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment in a small white town, and this is also when I was in grad school.
Okay.
And I had a neighbor who lived adjacent to me.
Okay.
And so he would see me every day as I walk into my apartment, and he's also sitting there on the porch every day, even at nighttime, because there are days where I don't get in until like late at night, and he always has an American flag up on his porch. And there was one day where he was like, he jokingly comes up to me, he was like, "Are you making bombs in your apartment?" And I'm like, "What? Like excuse me, like I didn't hear that." He was like, "Are you making bombs in your apartment?" And I was just like, "Are you joking?" "No, of course not. I'm a grad student. You know, I don't have time to cook. Why would I have time to like make bombs?" And so he was like, "Just asking in case you're one of those, you know." And then he started rambling off about how you just never trust people these days because, you know, you're one of those. You know, if you're one of those or those people, and you know, and a couple of things happen at once, right? So like my body shuts down. It's a mechanism that allows me to, I don't know, stop myself from like feeling the situation. Also, for me not to get mad, because if I were to get mad, it would be a really ugly scene. And you know, and after that, I just never really felt safe because he would still stare at me every time I walked from my car to my door. And you know, I think in that particular situation, it made me thought about a lot of things. Like, I have the privilege of like being a brown person who looks the way that I do, and who's also a woman who seems less intimidating. I don't look like I'm from the Middle East. I am not wearing a headscarf. You know, it puts into like perspective of my privileges, but also, you know, it comes into question of like of whether if this guy were to do something to someone who he is looking for, you know, would I step in? And the answer is yes. Like, I would step in, and it makes me think about like, you know, what is allyship if you're not willing to put yourself in harm's way. But I also acknowledge that I can do this because I don't have attachments, I don't have a family, I don't have people depending on me. But that was a situation where it was, I don't know if I was necessarily discriminated against, but I think I was, to answer that question, I was discriminated against, but I also think that it was talking about a bigger picture, right? And it was talking about our overall fear as a community, and what this presidential era has allowed communities to think of. We live in a space of fear, and you know, whether it is people of color who feel fear, but I really think it's the white people who feel fear, right? It's them who need to worry that, you know, like people of color are never gonna go away. So when Trump is no longer the president, like how is this fear gonna manifest? And you know, a lot of other small things have happened. I shouldn't say they're small; they're actually pretty significant. Happened around this time too, and you know, but Michigan itself, Michigan as a state, is like a huge recipe for this type of disaster. And you know, I left the state, but I still feel a lot for communities of color who are there because I feel like there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I feel sad that I'm not a part of that work on the ground level, but I hope to be a part of that work, even from afar. I don't know if you wanted a more like specific example. I have so many. I don't even know where to start, and so
I appreciated that story. Thank you. Let's see. Did you tell anyone this story?
I did. I think my first reaction was I was really scared, and so I did tell people. I think I shared on Facebook.
Okay.
Because you know the reason why I did that is because I wanted people to know that if something were to happen to me, you'll know that it's because of this, and you know, like it's just. I don't know if it's the fact that this person felt like he needed to have a sense of power over me to say that, but I never felt comfortable in my home after that.
Wow.
And you know, and walking from my car to my door is like what, 20 like feet, and I still feel uncomfortable, and it's not like a door is really gonna do anything, and so, but it was just. You know, and you know, I think you think that racism or discrimination is like people calling you names or people saying mean things, but this was just him sitting there looking at me, you know, and how do you explain to people that you feel threatened when somebody just sits there and look at you? Like, how do you report something like that and be taken seriously? And so, then it brings up the idea that we have to stop talking about discrimination, that it's like visible, or that it's like something that's so like black and white. Like sometimes it's not. It's just there. And so like even like his flag, he also had a Confederate flag, like just something like that. You know, things that make you feel uncomfortable. And I think that he did it for power. Like he wanted people to know that. Like I represent this history, and if you come to my house, like this is what I'm gonna do, and but
institutionally, I'm wondering if so you shared it out on Facebook. Did you talk to anyone at the institution or anything that would allow you to report such?
I think maybe I did, but isn't it their job to also report it? Because like if I told my supervisor, it's their job to report it, right? Or
some are more mandatory.
Yeah,
others,
and so I think I shared it. I don't know whether it's reported or not, but you know, people were nice. Like they were like, if you need another place to stay for a time being, like let me know. But I think for me, like even though I was like scared of my own safety, what was more menacing in the city is to me was what's happening in the big picture. And I don't think of that. I don't think I got that across to people that that's what terrifies me. Is that like whether I like it or not, as a person who is rather privileged in my woman of color identity, that I am also a piece of this puzzle, and I'm a part of this, and so for me it represents the bigger picture. But I don't know why that particular experience is jumping up, but it did.
I'm glad you shared it. Wow, thanks. So question number 6 is, how do your experiences in higher education influence the process of becoming who you are?
Oh, okay, I lied. This is the hardest question. Because, you know, I represent the system. Like everything that I am represents the system. And I always tell people this, that higher education as a whole, is probably one of the biggest colonizer in my life. And it is, has dictated the way that I have seen myself for probably as long as I can remember. And I think it stems from the idea that if I was just a good student, if I worked hard enough, that if I was just intelligent enough, that I can overcome some of these barriers, right, that are put in front of me. And I think it's not until I got older where I'm like, no, it can't. Like, higher education is an institution, a barrier self, and so I think, you know, even like coming down to like higher education, like why did I decide to go into the field of higher ed? I think I would never have gone into higher ed if I actually had a good experience in higher ed. I think a lot about how one of my good friends, Lauren, I talked to her a lot about like, would I be where I am right now if I was white? And the answer is no, because then, and the things that like, it's not just about being white, right? Somebody who is privileged, someone who is rich. We're taught that education is able to give you like wings to like step over certain boundaries, but that's not necessarily true, actually. And you know, sometimes I find myself saying that to students myself, and sometimes it hurts to be able to tell them that lie, but I think they needed to hear something. But this is probably the question that I really don't know how to answer, because I think higher education is a space of pain and trauma, and it's also a place that has greatly shaped the wider version of myself, the version that I bring out to the world when I'm in a professional white setting, the version that I think most of my colleagues know. And higher education is the reason why I sometimes can't communicate with like my mom, with other people that I love, that I am so far apart from them because of my educational experience. I feel like my education sometimes is a barrier between me and other people. But I also think it brings me a lot of sadness, because I always tell people that I don't know if I can ever tell my mom what I do for a living. Like, I don't think she can understand that. And I don't think she can understand like the weight of the effort that I put into like being who I am and getting the education that I got, and I don't think she can understand like what I had to strip away. And you know, I think I can't even begin to understand what I strip away, because that'll take way too much processing that I have the brain capacity to do at the current time. But I had some time to do that when I was in grad school, and I think that's probably why I always tell people I cried either every day or every week in grad school. Yeah, I totally did. And it's because you'll be confronted with like yourself, and and so I think that confrontation, and also you're learning how to become an educator, and if you don't try to make sense of like all this baggage, then how are you going to be able to teach other people if you can't find a space to teach from, and you can't make sense of what education is? And so a lot of the unpacking happened in grad school. I'm really glad that it happened when I had a support system that was also going through the same time like thing, but I still think it takes a lot. It still needs a lot of unpacking.
Sure. How did you cope with it? I mean, like, you unpack, and then coping is, as an artist, as a homeowner, like, must be. Yeah,
and you know, I couldn't even do my art because I was so busy in grad school that and part of that identity was the fact that I didn't have an artist identity at that time. I wasn't practicing, and I didn't have a way to like visualize what I was going through because I didn't have time to.
Sure.
In terms of how did I cope with it, I think I had amazing women of color in my cohort. They helped me through the process. They were there when I needed them. I had amazing faculty, women of color faculty members. Um, even though even though they didn't say much, like you could tell that they were still embodying that type of experience. Um, I had an Asian graduate group that I was a part of. Um, but I think I was very isolated from the Hmong community when I was in grad school. In fact, I joke about this, but I even went to I'm not religious at all, and in fact, the Christian church has a I don't know, I have a complicated relationship with Christianity, but I had to find a Hmong church because that was the only way that I could like find a sense of community. And I was a hot mess in grad school. I always tell people that if you knew me in grad school, like I'm not really that person. Like I'm not always that mad. I'm not always that like emotional.
Sure.
But it was also the fact that I like these emotions didn't have anywhere to go, and so they spilled out in different ways. And like spilling is probably the best way to explain it. Is that like I think grad school I was like spilling over the broom on the floor in the hallways, and I think people didn't like visually see it, but like it was there, and I was spilling all the time. And like if I were to like paint an experience about that, it would be spilling. I was spilling all the time. And so because it was just an overflow of a lot of things. But I don't necessarily know how I really got through that, to be quite honest with you. I can tell you that I am in the process of still healing from it, and I really want to go back to get my PhD, but like I'm terrified of like that experience, and I'm terrified that I may not have the support system that I did have in my master's program. And so that's that fear and that anxiety is what's keeping me from applying for my PhD.
So the support system helped pull you through.
I think so.
Sure.
Yeah. And I also think like I didn't come home. I had to eliminate things that would make me emotional, and that included my family.
Yeah.
And I always tell people that, you know, I did so well academically. It had nothing to do with school. Like I did well academically. Because those are the things I could control, right? I could control my grades. And I can control my attendance. I can control, but there were other things I couldn't control. Like I couldn't control how my identity was unpacking in front of everyone. I felt naked all the time, and I felt like raw probably like every single day. And it sucks because like I think sometimes I isolate myself from students because I'm like I don't want this to like affect you all. But I'm in a much better place right now.
I'm so glad to hear.
Yeah. I feel stability right now, but I didn't feel that.
What's the change?
My supervisor is a great support system. I work with other amazing women, both women, white women and women of color. I have Hmong students. It's weird because I think I was very strategic when I got this job. I made a promise to myself in grad school that if I were to get a job, I will be supporting students of color. It doesn't matter what capacity I'm at. I will that should be the foundation of what I do, and not just students of color, but students with marginalized identities. So I think being able to see yourself reflected in students is an amazing feeling.
Absolutely.
And I don't think I've ever had that. Because most of the time I've just supported white students for the most part, and when you see yourself reflected in student, then it gives you a moment of like clarity, and a moment of like, it also allows you to measure, right? And I think that I haven't really been able to measure because I've always been around white students, and I can never measure myself with them because we don't have the same measurement.
Yeah.
But seeing myself among other students of color and Hmong students, you're able to measure like, oh yeah, like yeah, I've actually been okay you know, I've been successful in what I'm doing. Like I can own this success, and you know, it's weird that it took me seeing that to be able to own that, like realistically own. I think I've always owned my success, but it was not until I realized I really saw myself in my students that I fully understood that.
Wow. Thank you. I think we're on 7.
Yeah.
What experiences have helped you most to understand yourself?
Grad school, which I just explained to you, but aside from that, I think looking myself through the experiences of other women and others, specifically like other Hmong women in my family, and you know, I think in the Hmong culture, a lot of learning is seen through observation, and a lot of learning is seen through like practicing what other people are doing, and I think that, you know, my mom is, I'm just as lost as my mom is as lost as her grandmother, right? And so when you're in this state of like dislocation and like confusion, you pick up pieces that make sense for who you are, and you try to teach it the way that you do. And I think that I grasped onto a lot of that, right? So it took me a long time to be able to get a foundation that makes sense to me, because I was just testing here and there, and I didn't fully understand what that meant until I started to put these practices into my actual life, and that's when it started making sense. But I would say the experiences, sometimes they often are like the bad experiences, right? Like I think a lot about how my mother is a widower now, and how she's being treated by, you know, our extended family. I think about how both of my sisters are divorced, and how they treated themselves in perspective to how their positionality in the culture is, how other people have treated them, how they have policed their bodies and their experiences based off the expectations of other people. I think a lot about my sister-in-law, who is old enough to be my mom, because my brother is also old enough to be my mom, and how she has to deal with my brother, who goes through relationships with other women as he goes through, like, I don't know, food. And so like seeing her have this like relationship with my brother, this hope that he's gonna one day come back and love her, and he's like, he cares about her, and you know, seeing all these women in their own fight against their sense of identity, like you would think that it would make me jaded, but I think in a lot of ways it reminded me of like, well, why can't you do it when you don't even have these like type of like barriers? Like, you need to figure it out for yourself, because even like women like them are able to find a sense of identity among the rebel. And so and you know, I say this, but you know, they're not weak and fragile women, like they're strong. And the examples that I've given have painted them as maybe like a little fragile, but these women are strong, and in a lot of ways they're the foundation of our family. And so I think that it's very encouraging to see that, and because you see that there's still stability among like people who are still in the process of finding their identity, or whether their identity is a patch-up version of what they want it to be. But I think what I learned from this is the sense of resiliency, and I think it took me a long time to realize that was resilience, because I think growing up I have a lot of anger, that I wanted more positive like woman role model in my life, but why is it that I didn't have it? But then then I think it was not until I got older where I'm just like, you know, I think I've always had positive role models. I wasn't able to see the positivity, because I think when you look, sometimes you often only see the like if you look at a broken cup, you often only just see the cracks, and you don't see that it's still functioning. And so, but it took time for me to be able to see that perspective.
Sure. You mentioned a little bit about how your mom, as a widower, was being treated. Can you help me understand some of the examples? Just a few.
That's such a long story, and you know, depending on who you ask, because I think my uncles and my cousins will completely disagree with this. Even some of my siblings, but
from your perspective.
From my perspective, yeah. I think like so much of her identity had to do with my father, right? And when my father passed away, like she wasn't invited to things. She no longer held like the woman with the household title. The title then goes to my brother, right? And you know, we had a lot of like how would you say it, like rocky experiences with my extended family, and matter of like my father's will and his money, and my mom being considered like money hungry, and wanting my father's like insurance money. It's a whole lot of mess. And you know, I have 11 siblings, and when you start looking at money, like there's not enough money that anybody could leave behind to take care of 12 kids. And so I think in a lot of ways there was hurt on both sides, but I don't think that my extended family did a really good job at having our best interests in mind. And you know, and whether it's the fact that they were young and they were also learning themselves, but I think there was a lot of hurt there because my mom felt very isolated from like the only family that, like the family that she knew, but yeah, I guess that detail, without going into way too much like messy detail, but it's just I don't know if you wanted something else.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it. Our last question is, if you could show your identities on a work of art, what would that art look like?
You know, I don't think I've ever been able to successfully do this. Because I think that sometimes, because of my life experiences, I tend to think of myself in third person. Wow. Like, even though I'm going through these experiences, I don't really see them until I see it reflected in other people. And I think about it always like how, like, I feel like I'm walking through life with a mirror, and it's not until like I see it and then I start to realize that, that's what I'm experiencing too. That's who I am. And I think a lot of it is my upbringing as a Hmong woman, right? You're taught that people's needs come before your own, and you're there to cater to people, and but in terms of like how my identities will show up in my artwork, I think I can't talk about my identities without including like other amazing women in my life, right? So I feel like I'm a combination of all of them, and even though I am myself at the same time too, I learned a lot from them, and a lot from them when I didn't have a sense of like grounding my own identity. So I feel like my self-portrait per se will probably be a combination of all of them. And probably the closest thing that I did to it was my last recent painting that I did for one of my teachers' showcase, and it was an identity about like, it was a piece about like, what does protection mean to me and who protects me, and obviously it's my identity that protects me, but like also what makes up my identity. So that piece, I think, is probably on my Facebook somewhere. I think you've seen it too.
I think I have.
Yeah, but I think that's probably the closest thing they'll come to it. But asking artists like how you show your identities in artwork, that's it's a loaded question because it's like I think artists spend their whole life doing that, right?
Yes.
And
Changes.
and it changes, yeah, constantly. And um, in fact, you could even argue that all my pieces of work are a piece of my identity, and I wouldn't argue with that. Like, I think that's true to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah,
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think your "What does protection mean to me" piece. So I think it's a young girl with some Zen doodles around it. Is that
yeah, you can
Okay.
call it that way. Yeah, because I think for me it was I have to have the picture in front of me for me to be able to like explain it a little bit more. But it's a me paying homage to like other women of color in my life, and it's also me paying homage to the fact that um, there's a story in the more I guess contemporary like Hmong folklore, like what it means to become a tiger, right? And when you start to adopt the features and the experiences of like ghosts, and I think a lot about how like my experience in America has been like that is when I start to adopt the identities of like people that but start to adopt the identity of white people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also about like how do you find power in becoming a tiger, um, and um, and so I think there's a lot about that painting that I still have to unpack, but that's a little bit about what it is. And so I think people don't really understand that painting was probably about that. I think people get trapped in the intricateness
Yeah.
of the painting.
Yep.
But
See that.
for me, like it's that painting is very much a self-reflection and a piece of journey, and a piece about like what is it that I do keep with me to protect me and remind myself that I'm still grounded even though sometimes I feel like I'm not. And but yeah,
I will definitely go back
and look
at it from that lens.
Yeah, that lens.
Yeah. So thank you for elaborating more on that piece. Awesome. Thanks. I think that those are. Do you have anything else that?
No, these are such hard questions. I'm just like, but they're very thought provoking.
Is that what you mean by hard, or you mean hard as in something else?
They're hard in the sense that they are requiring me to like face certain things, right? And some of these stuff like for example, like when you asked about my mom and her relationship with my extended family, like those are stuff that I haven't been able to really unpack because I had to unpack that with her. And she hasn't been in the space where I can talk to her about it. And so like some of these just timing is not like right. So hard in that sense that there are things that there are questions that there are like things that are still left to be answered, and I don't necessarily have all the answer, but also hard because I feel like when you have the identity as a Hmong woman, sometimes you're like nothing's very ever clear. And even though I may be able to talk to you about my identity, like my power and my voice can be taken away just as quickly because people can be like, you're wrong, that's not what it means to be a Hmong woman. And the fear of that too, and also the fear that I'm speaking for myself, but in a lot of ways, like people are going to see this and think that I'm speaking on behalf of other Hmong women as well. And I can't, even though I can't speak about all women, all Hmong women experiences, I think in a lot of ways, whether I like it or not, I represent that. And so, but also hard because I think that I'm talking to someone who I don't know you very well. I've known you, but I also don't know you very well. And so I think that's actually a better way, right? Because then I'm more able to disclose information. But in a sense, like there is like, what do I tell? What do I not tell?
Sure.
And you know, Mai Chao's my colleague. How is she gonna look at me after this like interview? Change. Okay. Yes. But those are some of the fears coming in. But
if I can ease your fear, my hope is to empower voices that are historically marginalized and have always been silenced. And so I think it makes the most sense for me as Hmong American women to like bring these voices out there so that other sisters that are going to be a part of higher ed will see our experiences and say, oh, I can relate to that. You know, just like other women of color that have helped you process your own experiences. And I think it's powerful that you're willing to share that. So I'm really grateful for that. In terms of the confidential limitation piece, like what you tell me is going to be just between us, and York is going to watch this, so no judgment whatsoever.
Yeah, no, don't worry. Trust me, I'm not very, how would I put it? I'm not very tight-lipped about my own experience.
Me too.
So I think sometimes to a fault. So
why is that? I mean,
because I
should
think
be able to tell.
I think it's also the fact that like being Hmong, you also exist within a community,
right?
And whether you like it or not, you represent a bigger mass of people, and that's also one of the hardest things that I think I have with like my art and my own experience is that sometimes I feel like it doesn't belong to me, and I feel mad that people have rights to it when I don't even have rights to it myself, or like I feel like I don't have rights to it, but yet other people have rights to my labor, and it's so hard for me to like explain to people, like as an artist, like people can take my labor and make it whatever they make sense of it just because they're Hmong and they identify, and but like it's weird because I don't even know how I feel about that, other than that sometimes I just don't want to give people that liberty, and so, but I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Absolutely makes sense to me. In the near future, there's going to be a revealing of a work of art for the community, and I'm involved with that, and so I can relate to what you're saying. Like, I put all this work into it, and when people are going to look at it, it's going to be interpreted through their own lens, and my true message will be lost. However, it's going to be a representation of a Hmong community member existing within the larger community. So maybe I should be proud of that, you know, so that when other people see it, they'll be like, oh, this is a non-white artist, you know. In that light, I feel empowered. You know, so I don't feel as guilty or upset that, hey, I'm being exploited here as an artist of color, you know. So I could definitely relate to what you're saying.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Representation matters, whether I like it or not. And so there's just a lot of things to negotiate.
Precisely, right there. Negotiating and being comfortable and being like content with the decisions that we make at the end of the day. Because as a Hmong American woman, it's not an easy route because you have to exist in two cultures, two communities. Actually, not just two. I'm using binaries, but I mean in multiple communities and entities that we exist in.
Yeah, very much.
So I was like processing your own stories, and I really appreciate that you are honest and like just tell me who you are.
Yeah, I'm a pretty honest person.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I think I'm gonna pause the recording right here, and I really appreciate your time, Lee.
I'm gonna try that.